standing in the marble-columned rotunda of the federal courthouse, watching my parents check their phones during the most important moment of my legal career, I realized that some victories taste bitter, even when they should be sweet. The Supreme Court justice was about to swear me in as the youngest federal judge in the district's history, but all I could see was my mother's bored expression and my father's impatient glance at his watch. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The afternoon sun streamed through the towering windows of the Theodore Morrison Federal Building, casting geometric patterns across the polished marble floor where nearly 200 guests had gathered. Black robes rustled as distinguished judges took their seats in the front rows. Law clerks and attorneys whispered respectfully near the back, their voices echoing softly in the vast space that had witnessed decades of American jurisprudence. Stood at the center of it all, wearing the traditional black judicial robe for the first time, my hands trembling slightly as I held the leather-bound Constitution that would anchor my oath. At 34, I was about to become Judge Tiffany Richardson, the culmination of 12 years of grinding through law school debt, brutal associate hours, and a relentless climb up the prosecutorial ladder that had cost me relationships, sleep, and most weekends for the past decade. The ceremony should have felt like vindication. Every professor who doubted a working-class kid from Ohio could make it to the federal bench. Every opposing counsel who'd underestimated the quiet woman, with the knockoff suits and determined eyes. Every moment of imposter syndrome that had whispered, I didn't belong in these hallowed halls of justice. But as I scanned the crowd, my gaze inevitably found my parents in the third row. Mom sat rigidly upright in the navy dress she'd worn to my cousin's wedding 3 years ago, her arms crossed, studying the architectural details of the ceiling like she was calculating square footage. Dad slouched beside her in his best suit, the one he'd bought for job interviews back in 2018, scrolling through something on his phone with the subtle movements of someone trying not to be noticed. Neither of them was looking at me. 20 feet. Behind them sat my law school roommate Jennifer Martinez, who'd driven up from Cincinnati with her husband and twin daughters just to watch me take the oath. Her face glowed with the kind of proud excitement I'd dreamed of seeing in my own family. She held up her phone to record the moment, mouthing, "You did it," with tears streaming down her cheeks. Next to her sat Marcus Thompson, my former supervisor from the district attorney's office, wearing the same gray suit he'd worn to my law school graduation party 6 years ago. He'd been the first person to believe I had what it took for federal prosecution, mentoring me through my first major cases and writing the recommendation letter that eventually led to this nomination. Federal appeals. Court judges filled the front section, their presence lending gravity to the proceedings. Judge Patricia Hawkins, who'd hired me as her clerk straight out of law school, sat in the front row with a smile that reached her eyes. She'd seen me work 18-hour days researching complex constitutional questions, drafting opinions that would shape precedent for decades. Justice Samuel Morrison himself stood behind the podium, the same man whose constitutional law textbook I'd studied until the binding cracked, whose majority opinions I'd memorized and cited in dozens of briefs. He'd agreed to perform my swearing-in ceremony, an honor reserved for only the most promising new federal judges. The crowd represented the legal community that had embraced me, nurtured my career, and celebrated each milestone along the way. Partners from white shoe law firms who'd tried to recruit me after my Supreme Court clerkship. Federal prosecutors who'd worked alongside me on high-profile cases. Law professors who'd invited me to speak at symposiums and contribute to law review articles. Yet the two people whose approval I'd sought my entire life sat in that third row, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Justice Morrison began, his introductory remarks, his voice carrying easily through the rotunda's perfect acoustics. He spoke about the weight of federal judicial responsibility, the sacred trust placed in those who interpret constitutional law, the careful deliberation required to balance competing interests in a complex democracy. Judge Richardson brings To this bench not only exceptional legal acumen, he continued, but the perspective of someone who has walked the path from public defender to prosecutor to judicial nomination. Her commitment to equal justice under law has been evident in every role she has undertaken. The crowd murmured appreciative agreement. I caught Jennifer wiping her eyes with a tissue, and Marcus nodding emphatically at the justice's words. Even the court reporters seemed to straighten with professional respect. But Mom had found something fascinating about her purse clasp, and Dad was now openly checking text messages. My mind drifted to the phone call I'd made 3 weeks ago, when the Senate had confirmed my nomination by an overwhelming bipartisan vote. I'd called them from my apartment that evening, still high from the victory, expecting them to share in the moment that represented everything I'd worked toward. "Federal judge," I'd said breathlessly into the phone. "Can you believe it? Your daughter is going to be a federal judge." There had been a pause before Mom's voice came through, flat and practical. "That's nice, honey. What's the pay like?" Not congratulations. Not pride. Not acknowledgement of the years of sacrifice that had led to this moment. Just a question about salary, as if I'd gotten a promotion at a regional bank branch. Dad had taken the phone then, and I'd held my breath hoping for something different. "Well," he'd said slowly, "I guess that's better than when you were doing that public defender thing. At least now you'll have job security." Job security. As if becoming a federal judge was simply a lateral move into a more stable government position. They'd agreed to attend the ceremony, but with the enthusiasm typically reserved for mandatory workplace training sessions. Mom had mentioned they'd need to leave early to avoid traffic, and Dad had asked twice whether there would be food at the reception. Now, watching them fidget through Justice Morrison's speech about constitutional interpretation and judicial independence, I felt the familiar ache of seeking validation from people who seemed incapable of providing it. The same feeling I'd had in elementary school when they'd missed my spelling bee championship because Dad had to work overtime. The same disappointment when they'd skipped my high school valedictorian speech because Mom had a headache. Justice Morrison was transitioning to my personal introduction, recounting my academic achievements and professional accomplishments for the assembled crowd, Stanford Law Review, Order of the Coif, Supreme Court clerkship with Justice Elena Rodriguez, 6 years as a federal prosecutor with a 93% conviction rate in complex white-collar cases. The legal community, in attendance, knew what those credentials meant. They represented thousands of hours of study, hundreds of briefs written and cases argued, a level of intellectual rigor that only a tiny percentage of attorneys ever achieved. In this room, among these people, my accomplishments carried weight and commanded respect, but I found myself watching my parents instead of absorbing the justice's words. Mom had moved on to checking her own phone now, probably scrolling through Facebook updates from her book club friends. Dad was shifting in his seat, already planning his escape route to the parking garage. The contrast was stark and painful. Here stood the most distinguished jurist in the country, praising my legal mind and judicial temperament in front of Ohio's legal elite, while the people who'd raised me treated it like an inconvenience in their Saturday afternoon. My throat tightened as Justice Morrison reached the conclusion of his remarks. "It is therefore my distinct honor to administer the judicial oath to Judge Tiffany Richardson, whose dedication to the law and commitment to justice will serve this district with distinction for years to come." The crowd rose for the oath ceremony, 200 legal professionals standing in respect for the tradition they were about to witness. The rustling of fabric and creaking of chairs filled the rotunda as everyone prepared for the formal moment, when I would become Judge Richardson, lifetime appointment to the federal bench, constitutional authority to interpret the law of the land. Everyone rose except my parents, who remained seated until Dad noticed everyone else standing and reluctantly pulled himself upright. Mom followed a beat later, looking around with mild confusion as if surprised by the sudden formality. Justice Morrison gestured for me to approach the podium, and I walked forward on unsteady legs, my mind split between the magnitude of the moment and the crushing disappointment of my family's indifference. The marble felt solid beneath my feet, the weight of history pressing down from the portraits of distinguished judges that lined the walls. As I raised my right hand to take the oath, that would define the rest of my career, I caught one last glimpse of the crowd. Jennifer had her phone raised, recording everything with tears streaming down her face. Marcus stood at attention like he was witnessing a military ceremony. Judge Hawkins clasped her hands together, beaming with the pride of a mentor watching. Her protégé achieved the pinnacle of judicial success, and my parents stood there looking like they were waiting for a bus. The reception hall buzzed with congratulations and champagne glasses clinking against crystal, but I stood frozen near the hors d'oeuvres table watching my parents head straight for the exit doors. They hadn't even waited for the formal receiving line to finish. I'd just taken the most significant oath of my professional life, pledged to uphold the Constitution before 200 distinguished guests, and secured a lifetime appointment that most attorneys could only dream of achieving. Yet Dad was already pulling out his car keys while Mom gathered her purse with the efficient movements of someone escaping an obligation. "Excuse me, Your Honor?" A young law student approached nervously, clutching a worn copy of Constitutional Law Casebook. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to say how inspiring your journey has been. I'm a first-generation college student too, and seeing someone like you reach the federal bench gives me hope that I can make it through law school." I forced a smile and signed her book, but my attention kept drifting to the reception hall entrance, where my parents were now making their final approach toward freedom. The student thanked me profusely and walked away glowing, probably imagining that this moment represented everything wonderful about achieving the American dream. If only she knew that the federal judge she'd just met felt more like an orphan at her own celebration. "Tiffany!" Jennifer appeared at my elbow with a fresh glass of champagne and a huge smile. "I can't believe you're actually a federal judge now. Judge Richardson. It has such a perfect ring to it." She followed my gaze toward the exit and her expression shifted. "Are your parents leaving already? The reception just started." Before I could answer, I heard Dad's voice cutting through the elegant chatter near the coat check. He was talking to Mom, but his voice carried in that way that suggested he wasn't particularly concerned about being overheard. "Well, that's finally over. Took long enough. You'd think they could speed these things up instead of all that fancy speech-making." Mom's reply was quieter, but not quiet enough. "At least she has a steady job now. Remember when she was doing that legal aid work? I kept wondering when she was going to get serious about making money." My champagne glass trembled in my hand. Legal aid work. She was talking about my 2 years as a public defender, where I'd represented indigent clients facing serious criminal charges, fighting to ensure that poverty didn't become a sentence to inadequate representation. Those had been some of the most meaningful cases of my career. David and Goliath battles where I'd stood between vulnerable defendants and a system that could crush them. To me, that work had been a calling. To Mom, it had been a failure to get serious about making money. Jennifer's face tightened with anger. "Did she just dismiss your public defender work as not being serious?" I nodded, unable to trust my voice. The public defender's office had been where I'd learned to try cases, to think on my feet, to advocate for clients who had no one else in their corner. Judge Patricia Hawkins had specifically mentioned that experience in her recommendation letter, calling it evidence of my commitment to equal justice and my ability to see the law from all perspectives. Dad's voice grew more audible as they approached the exit. "I still don't understand why she couldn't just go work for a regular law firm like normal lawyers do. All this government work, all this moving around between different jobs. When's she going to settle down and just pick a career path?" A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Pick a career path. I was standing in a federal courthouse wearing judicial robes, having just been sworn in for a lifetime appointment to interpret constitutional law, and he thought I still hadn't picked a career path. The irony was suffocating. My moving around between different jobs had been a deliberate progression through every level of the legal system. Public defender to prosecutor, to judicial clerk, to appellate work to federal judge. Each position had built on the last, creating the comprehensive understanding of law and procedure that made me qualified for this appointment. But to them, it looked like instability, like I couldn't hold down a regular job. Marcus Thompson materialized beside me, his face flushed with excitement and what appeared to be his third glass of wine. "Tiffany, Judge Richardson, God, I love saying that. You know, I was just telling Judge Hawkins about that Morrison case you handled 3 years ago, the one with the wire fraud charges. She said it was one of the most thorough prosecutorial briefs she'd ever reviewed. His enthusiasm was infectious, and for a moment I felt a flutter of the pride that should have been sustaining me through this entire celebration. The Morrison case had been a nightmare of complex financial transactions and international money transfers, the kind of white-collar prosecution that required months of investigation and meticulous attention to detail. But even as Marcus continued, describing my legal victories to anyone within earshot, I found myself straining to hear my parents' conversation as they waited for the elevator. "I just hope this judge thing doesn't go to her head," Mom was saying. "She's always been a little too proud of herself. Remember how she acted when she graduated from law school? Like she'd cured cancer or something. Too proud of herself. I'd graduated second in my class from one of the most prestigious law schools in the country, the first person in my extended family to earn a graduate degree, and she thought I'd been too proud." Dad chuckled in agreement. "Yeah, and then all that drama about getting that job with the Supreme Court. Made such a big deal about it, you'd think she was going to be the Chief Justice or something. Drama about the Supreme Court clerkship. I'd been selected from thousands of applicants nationwide to work directly with Justice Elena Rodriguez, researching and drafting opinions that would shape constitutional interpretation for generations. It was widely considered the most prestigious position available to young attorneys, a launching pad that virtually guaranteed future success in whatever direction I chose to take my career. To them, it had been drama and excessive pride. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and I watched my parents step inside without a backward glance. No goodbye, no congratulations, no acknowledgement that they were leaving their daughter's swearing-in reception before it had even properly begun. The elevator doors closed, sealing them away from the celebration of my greatest professional achievement. Did they just leave? Jennifer's voice carried a note of disbelief that mirrored my own feelings. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Around us, the reception continued in full swing. Federal judges shared war stories from their own early careers. Attorneys from the city's most prestigious firms approached to introduce themselves and offer their congratulations. Law clerks and legal scholars discussed recent Supreme Court decisions and speculated about the cases I might encounter in my new role. This was my community, these were my people, and they understood the significance of what I'd accomplished. Yet somehow their enthusiasm couldn't fill the hollow space left by my parents' indifference. Judge Hawkins approached our small group, radiating the kind of dignified warmth that had made her such an effective mentor during my clerkship year. "Tiffany, dear, what a magnificent ceremony. Justice Morrison's comments about your legal scholarship were particularly insightful. You should be enormously proud." "Thank you, Judge Hawkins. Having you there meant everything to me." She glanced around the reception with approval. "Such a wonderful turnout. I don't think I've seen this many distinguished members of the legal community in one place since Justice Rodriguez's retirement celebration. Your parents must be beside themselves with pride." The question hung in the air, and I felt Jennifer tense beside me. How do you explain to someone who's dedicated their entire career to the noble pursuit of justice that your own parents had just walked out of your federal judicial swearing-in because they were bored? "They had to leave early," I managed. "Prior commitments." Judge Hawkins nodded understanding, but I caught a flicker of something in her expression. She'd been practicing law for 40 years, had seen every possible family dynamic play out in the legal community. She knew what prior commitments usually meant when parents left their child's major milestone celebration early. "Well," she said gently, "I hope they know how extraordinary this achievement is. Federal judicial appointments don't come around often, especially for someone your age. The entire legal community is watching your career with great interest." As if summoned by her words, Dean Robert Walsh from Stanford Law School appeared with a broad smile and an outstretched hand. "Judge Richardson, congratulations on this tremendous appointment. The law school is already planning to feature your story in our alumni magazine. From Stanford Law Review editor to federal judge in 12 years. That's the kind of trajectory we love to showcase for prospective students." More congratulations followed. A federal prosecutor from the Eastern District mentioned a complex criminal case she hoped I'd consider handling. A constitutional law professor from Ohio State asked if I'd be interested in guest lecturing about judicial decision-making. A clerk from the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals introduced himself as someone who hoped to argue before my court someday. Each interaction should have reinforced the magnitude of what I'd achieved. Instead, they only highlighted the absence of the two people whose recognition I'd sought my entire life. The reception wound down as evening approached, and gradually, the crowd thinned as distinguished guests made their polite departures. Jennifer insisted on helping me gather the congratulatory cards and flowers that had accumulated near the gift table, chattering excitedly about the ceremony and the impressive guest list. "I counted at least 6 federal judges," she said, carefully arranging a bouquet of white roses. "And did you see how many people wanted to talk to you? Tiffany, you're kind of a big deal now." I smiled at her enthusiasm, grateful for the friend who'd driven 3 hours just to witness my swearing in, who'd cried during the oath ceremony, who understood that this moment represented years of sacrifice and determination. As we packed the last of the gifts into boxes, Jennifer grew quiet. Finally, she looked up from folding tissue paper and asked the question I'd been dreading. "Are you okay? I mean, really okay? Because your parents leaving like that." She trailed off, searching for diplomatic words. "It's fine," I said automatically. "They're just not really comfortable with formal events." Jennifer gave me a look that suggested she wasn't buying that explanation. "Tiff, this wasn't just a formal event. This was your swearing in as a federal judge. This was history. History." She was right, of course. Somewhere in the National Archives there would be documentation of today's ceremony. My judicial commission would be filed with the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts, legal databases, would list Judge Tiffany Richardson among the federal judiciary, with today's date marking the beginning of my tenure. But the people who'd raised me had treated it like an inconvenient interruption in their weekend plans. As Jennifer and I loaded the boxes into her car, I caught myself glancing toward the parking garage where my parents had disappeared hours earlier. Part of me had hoped they might reconsider, might come back to the reception, might realize they'd made a mistake in leaving so abruptly. The parking garage was empty except for our cars and the security lights casting long shadows across the concrete. They were gone, and they weren't coming back. The pattern had started in my sophomore year of college, during what should have been a celebration of my acceptance to Stanford Law School. I'd driven home to Youngstown that March weekend, acceptance, letter in hand, practically vibrating with excitement about sharing the news that would change everything for our family. I'd found them in the living room, Dad watching a basketball game while Mom sorted through coupon inserts from the Sunday paper. The acceptance packet from Stanford lay spread across the coffee table between us, the cardinal red logo gleaming under the overhead light. "Full scholarship," I'd said, unable to contain my excitement. "Can you believe it? Stanford Law School with a full ride, everything paid for." Dad had glanced at the papers without much interest. "California, huh? That's pretty far away." "It's Stanford, Dad. One of the best law schools in the world." Mom had looked up from her coupons with a frown. "How long is law school again? 3 more years?" 3 years, but it's Stanford. Graduates from Stanford Law go on to clerk for Supreme Court justices, work at the biggest firms, become federal judges. "That's a long time to not be making any money," Mom had observed, returning to her careful clipping of grocery store discounts. That conversation had lasted maybe 5 minutes before they'd moved on to discussing whether the Cavaliers had any chance in the playoffs. I'd sat there holding the acceptance letter that represented everything I'd worked toward through college, feeling like I'd announced I was planning to move to Mars. Later that evening, I'd called my academic advisor, Professor Linda Crenshaw, the woman who'd encouraged me to apply to top-tier law schools despite my working-class background. "They don't understand what this means," I'd told her, trying to keep the disappointment out of my voice. Professor Crenshaw had been quiet for a moment before responding. "Tiffany, some families don't know how to celebrate achievements they can't relate to. That doesn't make your accomplishment any less remarkable. But they're my parents. Shouldn't they be excited?" "They should be, yes. But sometimes the people closest to us have the hardest time seeing our potential. That's when you need to build your own support system, your own chosen family of people who understand your journey." That phone call had been my first lesson in emotional independence, though I hadn't recognized it at the time. Professor Crenshaw had become the first person in what would eventually become my professional family, the mentors and colleagues who would celebrate my victories when my biological family couldn't. Moving to California for law school had been liberating in ways I hadn't anticipated. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who valued academic achievement, who understood that legal scholarship required sacrifice and dedication, who spoke the language of intellectual ambition that had felt so foreign back home. My study group became my closest friends. Jennifer Martinez from Cincinnati, whose parents had driven 12 hours to attend our first-year orientation. David Kim from Portland, whose immigrant parents called him twice a week to check on his grades. Sarah Bennett from Atlanta, whose mother sent care packages filled with homemade cookies and encouraging notes about becoming the first lawyer in the family. I'd listened to their stories of family pride and support, with a mixture of joy for them and envy for what I'd never experienced. When David's parents flew out for Parents' Weekend, bringing traditional Korean dishes and beaming with pride as they toured the law library, I'd made excuses about why mine couldn't make the trip. The truth was simpler and more painful. I hadn't even told them about Parents' Weekend. Professor Margaret Stone had been my constitutional law instructor that first semester, a brilliant former federal prosecutor who'd clerked for Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg decades earlier. She'd noticed something in my exam answers, a particular way of analyzing complex constitutional questions that went beyond mere memorization of legal precedents. "Have you considered applying for a judicial clerkship after graduation?" she'd asked during office hours one October afternoon. "I'm not sure I'm qualified," I'd replied honestly. "Most clerks come from families of lawyers, people who understand how the system works." Professor Stone had leaned back in her chair, studying me with the intensity she usually reserved for oral arguments. "Tiffany, your background is an asset, not a liability. You see legal problems through a different lens because you've lived experiences that most law students haven't. That perspective is exactly what the federal judiciary needs." She'd spent the next hour outlining a strategic plan for my law school career: law review editorial positions, summer internships with federal judges, specialized coursework in constitutional interpretation. Each step was designed to build the credentials that would make me competitive for the most prestigious clerkships. "But here's the most important piece of advice I can give you," she'd said as our meeting ended. "Stop waiting for other people to validate your ambitions. Your worth as a legal scholar isn't dependent on anyone else's recognition." That advice had proved prophetic during my second year, when I'd been selected as an editor for Stanford Law Review. I'd called home to share the news, explaining that only the top students were chosen for editorial positions, that it was a tremendous honor that would open doors throughout my career. "That sounds like a lot of extra work," Mom had replied. "Are you sure you have time for that on top of your regular classes?" Extra work. She'd reduced one of the most competitive academic achievements in legal education to extra work. I'd up the phone and immediately called Professor Stone instead. She'd invited me to her office the next morning to celebrate with coffee and pastries, listening as I described the article I was planning to write about Fourth Amendment privacy rights. In the digital age, your parents don't understand this world, she'd said gently. But that doesn't mean you should stop achieving in it. Sometimes the people we love most are the least equipped to appreciate our greatest accomplishments. The summer after my second year, I'd landed a research position with Judge Patricia Hawkins on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. The work was challenging and intellectually stimulating, involving complex questions of federal jurisdiction and constitutional interpretation that would shape legal precedent for years to come. Judge Hawkins had taken a particular interest in my career development, inviting me to observe oral arguments and participate in chambers discussions about pending cases. She'd shared stories about her own path to the federal bench, the mentors who'd guided her career, and the importance of building professional relationships based on mutual respect and shared commitment to the law. The legal profession can be isolating, she'd told me one afternoon as we reviewed briefs in a particularly complex constitutional case. Especially for people who don't come from traditional legal families. You need to create your own network of supporters, people who understand your journey and want to see you succeed. Under her guidance, I'd begun attending judicial conferences and legal symposiums, meeting other young attorneys who shared my passion for public service and constitutional law. These weren't just networking events. They were opportunities to connect with people who spoke my professional language, who understood the intellectual rigor required for serious legal work. The contrast with my family interactions became increasingly stark. When I'd been invited to present my law review article at a national constitutional law conference, my parents' primary concern had been whether I was spending too much money on travel. When I'd been selected for a summer internship with the Department of Justice's Criminal Division, they'd asked whether it paid as much as the corporate law firm positions my classmates were pursuing. When I'd received the offer to clerk for Justice Elena Rodriguez at the Supreme Court, the pinnacle of legal achievement for any law student, they'd wondered aloud whether I was ever going to get a real job instead of all these temporary positions. Justice Rodriguez had become the most influential mentor of my early career, a woman who understood the challenges of navigating legal institutions as someone from outside the traditional power structures. During our first meeting, she'd looked at my resume and nodded approvingly. "Professor Stone speaks very highly of your analytical abilities," she'd said. "But I'm more interested in your motivation. Why do you want to practice law?" I'd given her the answer I'd been preparing since my law school application essays, something about justice and equality, and the power of legal institutions to protect vulnerable populations. She'd listened patiently, then asked a different question. "What do you do when the people closest to you don't understand your choices?" The question had caught me off guard. Somehow, she'd seen through my polished exterior to the underlying struggle I'd never discussed with anyone except Professor Crenshaw and Professor Stone. "You create your own validation system," I'd answered honestly. "You find people who understand the work and can appreciate what you're trying to accomplish." Justice Rodriguez had smiled. "That's exactly right, and that's why you're going to be an excellent clerk. You've already learned one of the most important lessons of a legal career. Your professional identity can't depend on other people's recognition." Working in the Supreme Court had been transformative, not just for my legal education, but for my understanding of professional relationships. Justice Rodriguez had treated me as a junior colleague rather than just a student, involving me in substantive discussions about constitutional interpretation and judicial philosophy. Her other clerks had become close friends and professional allies, people who understood the weight of responsibility that came with interpreting the Constitution. We'd worked together on landmark decisions, researching historical precedents, and crafting legal arguments that would influence American law for generations. When my clerkship ended, Justice Rodriguez had written a recommendation letter that opened every door in the legal profession. Federal judges across the country knew her reputation for selecting exceptional clerks, and her endorsement carried enormous weight in the hiring process. You have the intellectual capacity for any path you choose, she'd told me during our final meeting. Corporate practice, academia, government service, eventually the federal bench itself. But whatever you decide, remember that your professional worth isn't determined by whether your family understands your achievements. I'd carried that advice through my transition to the U.S. Attorney's Office, where I'd specialized in complex white-collar criminal prosecutions. My colleagues there had become another layer of my chosen professional family, people who appreciated meticulous legal research and understood the satisfaction of building airtight cases against sophisticated defendants. District Attorney Michael Barrett had been my supervisor for those 6 years, a tough but fair prosecutor who'd pushed me to handle increasingly complex cases. He'd nominated me for the federal judicial opening, writing a recommendation that highlighted my trial experience and analytical skills. "You've earned this opportunity," he'd told me when the nomination was announced. "Every case we've worked, together, every brief you've written, every argument you've made in court, it's all led to this moment." His pride in my achievement had been evident and genuine, the kind of professional validation that had sustained me throughout my career. He'd understood that becoming a federal judge represented the culmination of years of preparation and sacrifice, that it was both an honor and a tremendous responsibility. The legal community had embraced my nomination with enthusiasm. Editorial. Boards had written supportive columns about my qualifications. Bar associations had issued statements praising my judicial temperament and legal experience. Former opponents in court had contacted senators to express their support for my confirmation. This was my true family, the community of legal professionals who understood the significance of constitutional law, who appreciated the intellectual rigor required for federal judicial service, who recognized that my appointment represented not just personal achievement, but progress for the broader legal profession. They would be the ones celebrating my swearing-in ceremony, understanding its historical significance and professional importance. They would be the ones whose respect and recognition would sustain me through the challenging cases and difficult decisions that lay ahead. I'd learned to stop expecting my biological family to provide the validation that my chosen professional family offered so readily. It had taken years to accept this reality, but the lesson had been essential for my emotional well-being and professional success. Some people are blessed with families who understand their ambitions and celebrate their achievements. Others have to create their own support systems, building networks of mentors and colleagues who can appreciate their journey and provide the encouragement necessary for continued growth. I'd chosen the second path, not by preference, but by necessity, and it had made all the difference in reaching this moment when Justice Morrison would administer the oath that would make me Judge Richardson. The pattern of dismissal had crystallized during my 3rd year of law school when I'd won the prestigious Philip C. Jessup International Law Moot Court Competition. Our Stanford team had defeated Harvard in the final round, arguing a complex case involving international environmental law before a panel of actual International Court of Justice judges. I'd called home that evening, still buzzing from the victory, wanting to share what felt like validation of everything I'd worked toward in law school. The competition had been grueling, requiring months of preparation and mastery of international legal principles that most attorneys never encountered in their entire careers. "We won the international competition," I'd announced breathlessly. Stanford beat Harvard, Yale, Oxford, every major law school in the world, and I was the lead advocate. There had been a pause before Dad's voice came through the phone. "That's nice, honey. Hey, did you see that thing on the news about student loan debt? Maybe you should think about getting out of school sooner rather than later." Student loan debt. I'd just achieved one of the highest honors available to law students, and his response was concern about educational expenses. The fact that my scholarship covered everything, that I was actually earning money through my law review position, seemed irrelevant to his worldview, where education was primarily an economic burden rather than an intellectual pursuit. Mom had taken the phone then, and I'd hoped for a different reaction. "Well, that sounds complicated," she'd said. "All that international stuff. Are you sure you want to get involved in foreign countries and their problems? Foreign countries and their problems. She'd reduced international law, one of the most sophisticated areas of legal practice, to meddling in other people's business. The conversation had lasted maybe 3 minutes before they'd moved on to discussing my cousin Rachel's engagement to her boyfriend of 6 months. Rachel's announcement had generated 15 minutes of excited chatter about wedding plans and venue options, while my international legal victory had warranted barely a minute of polite acknowledgement. That night, I'd walked across campus to Professor Stone's office, knowing she'd still be there grading exams under the warm glow of her desk lamp. When I'd knocked on her door, she'd looked up with immediate concern. "Tiffany? What's wrong? You should be celebrating tonight." I'd told her about the phone call, trying to keep my voice steady as I described my parents' reaction to news that had already spread through the law school community like wildfire. By morning, there would be congratulatory emails from professors, interview requests from legal publications, and networking invitations from international law firms. But the two people who should have been proudest couldn't even feign interest. "Professor." Stone had listened without interrupting, then closed her gradebook and gave me her full attention. "I need to tell you something that might be difficult to hear," she'd said gently. "Some parents can't celebrate their children's achievements because those achievements highlight their own perceived limitations." "What do you mean?" "Your success, in areas they don't understand, forces them to confront their own educational choices, their own career paths. Instead of feeling proud, they feel inadequate, so they minimize your accomplishments as a defense mechanism." The explanation had made intellectual sense, but it hadn't lessened the emotional sting of having my greatest achievements treated as inconveniences or sources of worry rather than celebration. This dynamic had repeated itself throughout my law school years with depressing consistency. When I'd been selected for the Stanford Law Review, they'd worried about the time commitment. When I'd received the offer to clerk for Justice Rodriguez, they'd questioned whether I was avoiding real-world experience. When law firms had competed to recruit me with 6-figure starting salaries, they'd wondered why I was considering government, work that paid significantly less. Every achievement became evidence of my impractical nature, my tendency to prioritize prestige over common sense, my apparent inability to make straightforward career decisions that they could understand and approve of. The contrast with my professional mentors had been stark and increasingly painful. Justice Rodriguez had sent handwritten notes celebrating my academic honors. Professor Stone had framed the newspaper article about our moot court victory. Judge Hawkins had introduced me at legal conferences as one of the most promising young constitutional scholars I've encountered. These professionals understood that each achievement built upon the previous ones, creating a coherent narrative of legal expertise and intellectual development. They saw the strategic nature of my choices, the careful construction of credentials that would open doors throughout my career. My parents saw only unnecessary complications and questionable priorities. The gap had widened further during my Supreme Court clerkship year. Working directly with Justice Rodriguez on landmark constitutional cases should have been the kind of experience that any family would celebrate and share with pride. Instead, my parents had treated it like an extended internship that was delaying my entry into real employment. When the clerkship ended and I'd accepted the position with the U.S. Attorney's Office, I'd hoped finally to earn their approval by choosing prosecutorial work that seemed more traditional, more comprehensible than the academic and judicial positions I'd held previously. "Finally, a regular job," Dad had said when I'd called to share the news. "Now you can start building a normal career." But even that victory had been short-lived. Within months, my parents were expressing concern about the dangers of prosecuting criminals, the stress of courtroom work, the long hours required for complex cases. When I'd been promoted to handle white-collar prosecutions, they'd worried about making enemies of powerful defendants. When I'd been assigned to a high-profile corruption case involving local politicians, they'd suggested I should request a transfer to something less controversial. When my conviction rate had earned recognition from the Department of Justice, they'd worried that I was becoming too focused on winning rather than finding balance in my life. Every success carried the weight of their disapproval, their inability to see achievement as something worth pursuing for its own sake. They'd never understood that prosecuting complex criminal cases wasn't just a job, but a calling, an opportunity to use legal skills in service of justice and public safety. My professional colleagues had seen it differently. District Attorney Michael Barrett had nominated me for the Attorney General's Award for Distinguished Service. Federal judges had commended my trial preparation and courtroom advocacy. Defense attorneys, despite being my opponents, had developed grudging respect for my thorough case preparation and ethical conduct. The legal community had begun to see me as a rising star, someone whose career trajectory suggested eventual judicial appointment or high-level government service. Profile articles in legal publications had highlighted my background as unusual for federal prosecutors, noting that most attorneys from working-class families didn't reach senior positions in prestigious offices. But those same articles, when I'd shared them with my parents, had generated concern about all that attention and suggestions that I should keep my head down rather than seeking recognition for my work. The wedding of my college roommate Jennifer had crystallized the fundamental disconnect between my two worlds. Jennifer's parents had hosted an elegant reception at their country club, where conversation naturally turned to career achievements and professional milestones. I'd been seated at a table with other successful professionals, including a federal appeals court judge, a prominent defense attorney, and a law school dean. The conversation had been intellectually stimulating, ranging from recent Supreme Court decisions to trends in legal education. My parents had seemed lost and uncomfortable, speaking only when directly addressed and offering brief, non-committal responses to questions about their daughter's legal career. When the federal judge had praised my work on a recent constitutional case, Mom had smiled politely but said nothing. Later, during the drive home, Dad had been unusually talkative. "Those people sure think highly of themselves," he'd observed. "All that talk about important cases and famous judges, you'd think they were curing diseases or something." "They're federal judges and law professors, Dad. They shape constitutional law and train the next generation of attorneys." "I guess," he'd replied doubtfully. "Just seems like a lot of fancy talk about what's basically paperwork and arguing." Paperwork and arguing. He'd reduced the entire legal profession, including my own career, to clerical work and petty disputes. Mom had chimed in from the passenger seat. "That judge who sat next to you seemed nice enough, but she kept going on and on about cases and decisions. Couldn't she talk about anything else?" The judge in question had been discussing her recent opinion in a landmark civil rights case that would protect voting access for thousands of citizens. To my parents, it had been boring shop talk that dominated dinner conversation inappropriately. These family interactions had become increasingly exhausting, requiring me to translate my professional experiences into terms they could accept or, more often, simply avoiding discussion of my work altogether. Holiday dinners became exercises in deflection, steering conversation toward safer topics that wouldn't highlight the growing divide between my achievements and their capacity to appreciate them. My promotion to senior prosecutor had generated the same pattern of responses. Initial acknowledgement followed by concerns about increased responsibility, longer hours, and the stress of handling more serious cases. When I'd been featured on the cover of Ohio Legal Weekly as Prosecutor of the Year, they'd worried about the pressure of public recognition. When I'd been invited to teach trial advocacy at Stanford as an adjunct professor, they'd questioned whether I was taking on too much work. When the American Bar Association had selected me for their prestigious leadership council, they'd suggested I should focus on one job instead of spreading myself too thin. Each honor, each recognition, each step forward in my career had been reframed as evidence of poor judgment or misplaced priorities. The pattern had become so predictable that I'd stopped calling to share good news, knowing it would generate more stress than celebration. the federal judicial nomination had represented the culmination of this dynamic. When Senator Patricia Williams had called to inform me that I was being considered for the vacant seat on the federal district court, I'd experienced a moment of pure elation, followed immediately by dread about sharing the news with my parents. The nomination process itself had been intensive and thorough, involving FBI background checks, American Bar Association evaluation, and testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Legal scholars had analyzed my judicial philosophy, bar associations had endorsed my qualifications, and editorial boards had praised my nomination as an excellent choice for the federal bench. Throughout the confirmation process, my parents had focused on peripheral concerns rather than the historic nature of the appointment. They'd worried about the Senate hearings being televised, the scrutiny of FBI investigators, the media attention surrounding controversial nominees. When Senator Chuck Morrison had called to inform me that my nomination had been confirmed by a bipartisan vote of 87-13, I'd sat in my apartment for 20 minutes before calling anyone. The magnitude of the achievement had been overwhelming, but the prospect of my parents' reaction had been deflating. I'd called Jennifer first, then Professor Stone, then Justice Rodriguez, then District Attorney Barrett. Each conversation had been filled with genuine excitement and recognition of what this appointment meant for my career and for the legal profession more broadly. My call to my parents had been brief and anticlimactic. Congratulations followed immediately by questions about the pay scale and benefits package, concerns about the lifetime tenure requiring us to stay in Ohio, and suggestions that I should be careful not to let the position go to my head. Even at this pinnacle moment of my legal career, they'd managed to frame it as a potential source of problems rather than the culmination of 15 years of dedicated preparation and exceptional achievement. The swearing-in ceremony had been planned as a celebration not just of my appointment, but of everything it represented about merit, hard work, and the democratic institutions that allow talented individuals to rise to positions of constitutional authority regardless of their background. My parents had agreed to attend, but with the same enthusiasm they might reserve for a dental appointment. They'd asked about parking, expressed concern about the formal dress requirements, and wondered how long the ceremony would take. When Justice Morrison had called to offer his services for the swearing-in, I'd been honored, beyond words. Having a sitting Supreme Court justice administer the oath was an extraordinary privilege that recognized the significance of federal judicial appointments in our constitutional system. I'd shared this news with my professional mentors and colleagues, who had understood immediately what an honor it was to have Justice Morrison participate in the ceremony. Their excitement and pride had sustained me through the final preparations, even as my parents had treated the justice's participation as simply another complication in an already formal event. The morning of the ceremony, I'd stood in my apartment, looking at the judicial robe that would mark my transformation from prosecutor to federal judge, from advocate to arbiter, from someone who argued the law to someone who interpreted it. This should have been the moment when my parents finally understood what I'd been working toward all these years, when they could see the culmination of choices that had seemed impractical or overly ambitious from their perspective. Instead, it had been another day when their lack of understanding would be on full display before the legal community that had embraced me as one of their own. The breaking point came 3 days after my swearing-in ceremony, during what should have been a quiet Sunday morning of reflection and preparation for my first week as a federal judge. I'd been sitting in my home office, reviewing case files and familiarizing myself with the court's procedural requirements, when my phone rang. Mom's number appeared on the screen, and for a brief moment, I felt a flutter of hope. Maybe she was calling to apologize for leaving the reception early. Maybe she'd realized the significance of what had happened and wanted to make amends. Maybe, finally, she was ready to acknowledge what I'd accomplished. "Hi, Mom." "Oh, Tiffany, good, you're home. Listen, I need to ask you a favor." "Not an apology, not congratulations, a favor." "What's that?" Well, you know how your Aunt Carol's been having trouble with that contractor who's been working on her kitchen? The one who's been dragging his feet and charging her extra for everything? I set down the Supreme Court decision I'd been reading, already sensing where this conversation was headed. What does that have to do with me? She's been trying to get him to finish the work, but he keeps making excuses. And now he's saying she owes him more money than they originally agreed on. She thinks he's trying to cheat her. Mom, I'm a federal judge. I can't get involved in private contract disputes. But you're a lawyer, right? And now you're a judge. Can't you just call him and tell him he needs to finish the job? You know, use your authority or whatever? The request hit me like a physical blow. 3 days after taking an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States, to preside over federal cases that would shape American law, my mother was asking me to intimidate a kitchen contractor on behalf of my aunt. That's not how it works, I said, trying to keep my voice level. Federal judges don't handle small claims disputes, and we definitely don't make threatening phone calls to private contractors. Well, what good is being a judge if you can't help your own family? The question hung in the air, crystallizing everything that had been wrong with our relationship for the past 15 years. To Mom, my federal judicial appointment wasn't a historic achievement or a constitutional responsibility. It was a tool that should be available to solve her family's mundane problems. Mom, do you understand what a federal judge does? You're in charge of legal stuff, right? You make decisions about laws and criminals and things like that. Federal judges interpret the Constitution. We preside over cases involving federal crimes, civil rights violations, complex constitutional questions. We don't get involved in contract disputes between homeowners and contractors. That seems like a waste, she said dismissively. All that education and training just to handle big, complicated cases that don't affect regular people. Regular people. As if the constitutional rights I would spend my career protecting didn't affect regular people. As if the civil rights cases, the criminal prosecutions, the federal regulations that governed everything from workplace safety to environmental protection somehow existed in a vacuum separate from ordinary citizens' lives. Mom, every case I handle will affect regular people. That's the whole point of the federal court system. If you say so, she replied, clearly unconvinced. But I still think you could make one little phone call to help your aunt. It's not like anyone would know. That phrase, "it's not like anyone would know," revealed everything about how she viewed my new position. She saw federal judicial authority as a personal advantage to be exploited, rather than a public trust to be honored. The ethical constraints that governed my conduct weren't important principles, but inconvenient obstacles to using my position for family benefit. I'm not making that phone call, I said firmly. Fine. I just thought maybe since you finally got a good job, you could help out the family members who supported you all these years. Supported me. The revisionist history was breathtaking. The same woman who dismissed my law school achievements, questioned my career choices, and left my swearing-in ceremony early was now claiming to have supported me throughout my journey. After ending the call, I sat in my office staring at the case files spread across my desk. These represented real legal questions that would affect thousands of people's lives. Constitutional interpretation, federal jurisdiction, the careful balance between individual rights and government authority. This was the work I'd trained my entire adult life to perform. But my own mother saw it as irrelevant to regular people and less important than intimidating a kitchen contractor. That afternoon, I made a decision that would fundamentally change how I approached family relationships. I opened my laptop and drafted an email to Jennifer, Marcus, Judge Hawkins, and Justice Rodriguez. The subject line read, "Thank you." The message was brief but heartfelt. As I begin my tenure as a federal judge, I wanted to thank the people who have truly supported my journey. Your mentorship, encouragement, and friendship have made this achievement possible. I'm grateful to have you as my chosen family in this profession." Hitting send felt like a symbolic act, a formal recognition of where my real support system existed. These were the people who understood the significance of constitutional law, who appreciated the intellectual rigor required for federal judicial service, who celebrated my achievements without trying to exploit them for personal gain. 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed with responses. Jennifer's message was characteristically enthusiastic. "We're so proud of you. Can't wait to see the groundbreaking decisions you'll write." Marcus had sent a more formal reply. "It has been an honor to watch your career develop. The federal bench is fortunate to have someone of your caliber and integrity." Judge Hawkins wrote, "My dear Tiffany, watching you grow from a brilliant law clerk to a federal judge has been one of the great pleasures of my career. Your parents raised a remarkable woman, even if they don't fully understand what you've accomplished." That last line stung, because Judge Hawkins was being generous in a way that I could no longer afford to be. My parents hadn't raised me to become a federal judge. They'd raised me to be practical, conventional, and satisfied with modest achievements that they could understand and control. Everything that had prepared me for this position, the intellectual curiosity, the ethical rigor, the commitment to constitutional principles, had developed despite their influence rather than because of it. Justice Rodriguez's response arrived later that evening, and it was characteristically thoughtful. "The legal profession is fortunate to have someone who understands that judicial authority is a public trust, not a personal privilege. Your integrity will serve you well in the difficult decisions ahead." Reading her message, I realized she'd somehow intuited the phone call with my mother, the request to misuse judicial authority for family benefit. Her emphasis on integrity and public trust felt like validation of my refusal to make that contractor phone call, confirmation that I'd made the right choice even though it had disappointed my mother. That night, I made a second decision that felt equally important. I would stop calling my parents to share professional news. No more updates about significant cases, speaking engagements, or legal honors. No more attempts to translate my work into terms they might appreciate. No more hoping that the next achievement would finally earn their recognition and pride. Instead, I would invest that emotional energy in relationships with people who could celebrate my successes authentically. My professional mentors, my law, school friends, my colleagues in the federal court system, people who understood that constitutional law mattered, that federal judicial service was both an honor and a responsibility, that my appointment represented progress for the broader legal profession. The shift in perspective felt liberating, but also melancholy. Part of me had hoped that reaching the federal bench would finally bridge the gap between my achievements and their capacity to appreciate them. The phone call about the contractor had made clear that no level of professional success would ever be enough to earn their understanding or approval. But it had also clarified something important. I didn't need their approval anymore. The next morning, I walked into the federal courthouse as Judge Richardson for the first time, carrying myself with a different kind of confidence. Not the nervous energy of someone seeking validation, but the steady assurance of someone who knew her worth regardless of others' recognition. My first case involved a complex constitutional question about digital privacy rights, exactly the type of cutting-edge legal issue that would shape American jurisprudence for decades. As I reviewed the briefs and prepared for oral arguments, I felt the intellectual excitement that had drawn me to law in the first place. This was meaningful work that would protect citizens' constitutional rights in an evolving technological landscape. The attorneys arguing before me represented the finest legal minds in the country, presenting sophisticated arguments about Fourth Amendment interpretation in the digital age. My parents would never understand why this mattered, but that was their limitation, not mine. During my lunch break that first day, I received a text from my law school study group chat. David Kim had written, "Saw the news coverage of your first day as a federal judge. So proud to know you." Sarah Bennett had added. You're already making history. Can't wait to read your first published opinion. These messages, from friends who'd been there since the beginning of my legal education, carried more weight than any family approval I'd been seeking. They came from people who understood the journey, who appreciated the destination, who could celebrate the achievement without trying to diminish or exploit it. That evening, I called Justice Rodriguez to thank her for administering my oath and to seek her advice about managing the transition to judicial life. Our conversation ranged from practical matters like case management to philosophical questions about constitutional interpretation. How do you handle family members who don't understand the work? I asked toward the end of our call. She was quiet for a moment before responding. I learned early in my career that some people will never appreciate what we do, even if they love us. The key is finding validation in the work itself and in the community of people who share your commitment to justice. What if those people are your parents? Then you love them for who they are, but you don't look to them for professional validation. You build your own support system with people who can celebrate your achievements authentically. Her words confirmed the decision I'd already made. Love my parents as flawed human beings who'd done their best within their limitations. But stop expecting them to provide the recognition and encouragement that my professional community offered readily. The freedom was intoxicating. No more dreading phone calls about career news. No more translating complex legal concepts into oversimplified explanations. No more hoping that the next achievement would finally earn their pride. Instead, I could focus on the work itself, on the constitutional questions that would define my judicial career, on the mentorship relationships that had sustained me throughout law school and beyond. I was Judge Tiffany Richardson now, not because my parents finally understood what I'd accomplished, but because I'd stopped needing them to understand it. The real celebration of my appointment would come from the decisions I wrote, the constitutional principles I upheld, and the legal precedents I established. From the young attorneys who would appear before me and see that federal judicial positions were attainable for people from non-traditional backgrounds. From the law students who would read my opinions in constitutional law casebooks decades from now. That validation would be earned through excellence, integrity, and service to the constitutional principles that had guided my entire legal career. My parents' approval was no longer part of the equation, and for the first time in my adult life, that felt like relief rather than loss. The avalanche began 6 weeks into my tenure as a federal judge, triggered by something my parents never could have anticipated. A front-page story in the Washington Post titled, Rising Star, How Judge Richardson is Reshaping Federal Jurisprudence. I was reviewing briefs in my chambers when my assistant knocked on the door, holding a stack of newspaper clippings and printouts that had been flooding our office since dawn. Your Honor, the media requests are backing up. CNN wants a phone interview, NPR is asking about your judicial philosophy, and the Harvard Law Review wants to feature your recent opinion on digital privacy rights. The coverage had started with my first major decision, a case involving artificial intelligence surveillance that had caught the attention of constitutional law scholars nationwide. My 30-page opinion had balanced Fourth Amendment protections against technological innovation in ways that legal experts were calling groundbreaking and precedent-setting. Within hours, the decision was being discussed on legal blogs, cited in academic articles, and praised by civil liberties organizations. Constitutional law professors were assigning it to their students as required reading. Federal judges from other circuits were reaching out to discuss the reasoning behind my analysis. The Washington Post article had been particularly comprehensive, tracing my career from public defender through Supreme Court clerk to federal prosecutor to youngest sitting judge in the district. The reporter had interviewed everyone from Justice Rodriguez to my law school professors, painting a picture of steady excellence and intellectual rigor that had culminated in judicial appointment. But it was the human interest angle that would prove most devastating to my parents' carefully constructed narrative of benign neglect. Judge Richardson's rise to the federal bench represents something unprecedented in American jurisprudence, the article quoted Professor Stone as saying. She's not just exceptionally qualified, she's revolutionizing how we think about constitutional interpretation in the digital age. Justice Rodriguez had been even more effusive. I've mentored dozens of Supreme Court clerks over my career. Judge Richardson stands out not just for her analytical brilliance, but for her ability to see legal questions from perspectives that traditional legal education often overlooks. The article went on to detail my work on landmark constitutional cases, my role in reshaping federal prosecution strategy, and the historic nature of my judicial appointment at such a young age. It mentioned my working-class background in Youngstown, describing me as someone who'd transcended economic barriers to reach the pinnacle of American legal achievement. What the article didn't mention, because I'd never discussed it with reporters, was the complete absence of family support throughout this journey. The Washington Post's narrative was one of triumph over adversity, but it focused on economic and educational obstacles rather than the more personal challenge of pursuing excellence without familial recognition. That afternoon, my phone started ringing. The first call came from Aunt Carol, the same woman whose contractor dispute had triggered my moment of clarity weeks earlier. "Tiffany, I just saw the article in the paper. You're on the front page of the Washington Post." I had no idea. "You were such a big deal." Her excitement was genuine but painful, highlighting how little my own extended family had understood about my career trajectory. To them, I'd been the one who went to law school, rather than someone building toward federal judicial appointment. "Did you know about this?" I could hear her asking someone in the background, presumably her husband. "Our Tiffany is famous. She's one of the most important judges in the country." The conversation continued in this vein, with Aunt Carol recounting details from the article as if she were introducing me to myself. Every achievement the reporter had mentioned, the Supreme Court clerkship, the federal prosecution record, the judicial nomination, was news to her, despite these milestones having occurred over many years. When she hung up, promising to tell everyone at church about our famous judge, I felt a familiar mixture of gratitude and sadness. Gratitude that someone in my family was finally expressing pride in what I'd accomplished. Sadness that it had taken national media coverage to make my achievements visible to them. The second call came 2 hours later, from my mother. Her voice carried a strange quality I'd never heard before, somewhere between excitement and panic, as if she were trying to catch up on a conversation that had started without her. "Tiffany, honey, Mrs. Patterson from down the street just brought me a copy of the Washington Post. She said you're on the front page. I didn't even know they knew who you were." "They interviewed me about a case I decided," I said carefully, unsure how to navigate this unprecedented display of interest in my professional life. "It says here you're one of the youngest federal judges in history. Is that true?" "In this district, yes. And it says you worked for a Supreme Court judge. When did that happen?" "Right after law school. I was Justice Rodriguez's clerk for a year." There was a long pause, and I could hear papers rustling as she presumably read through the article again. "It says here that Justice Rodriguez called you exceptionally qualified and said you're revolutionizing constitutional interpretation." "Yes, she's been a wonderful mentor." Another pause, longer this time. "Tiffany, this article makes it sound like you're really important, like nationally important." The statement hung between us, carrying the weight of 15 years of minimized achievements and dismissed ambitions. For the first time, Mom was confronting the possibility that my career choices hadn't been impractical flights of fancy, but strategic steps toward something significant. "The work is important," I said simply. "But I mean, the article says professors are teaching your decisions in law schools. It says other judges are calling you for advice. It says—" Her voice trailed off as she apparently continued reading. "It says what, Mom?" "It says you're being mentioned as a potential Supreme Court candidate someday. Could that really happen?" The question revealed everything about how completely she'd misunderstood my career trajectory. The idea that someone she knew personally could be considered for the highest court in the land had apparently never occurred to her, despite my having clerked for a Supreme Court justice and maintained relationships throughout the federal judiciary. It's possible eventually. I'd need more experience on the federal bench first. The Supreme Court, she repeated, as if testing how the words sounded. My daughter might be on the Supreme Court. That possessive pronoun, my daughter, struck me as particularly ironic given her years of indifference to the career path that had made such consideration possible. The conversation ended awkwardly, with Mom promising to read the whole article more carefully, and me assuring her that I'd call if there were any major developments. But something had shifted fundamentally in her tone, a recognition that perhaps she'd been missing something significant all these years. The third call came that evening, from Dad. Tiff, I've been getting calls all day from people who saw that newspaper article. Bob from the plant, guys from the bowling league, even my supervisor mentioned it. Everyone's talking about how my daughter is this famous federal judge. My daughter, another possessive pronoun from someone who'd spent years treating my career like an incomprehensible hobby. I wouldn't say famous, Dad, just doing the job. But this article, it makes it sound like a really big deal, like bigger than I realized. Federal judicial appointments are significant, yes. I mean, I knew you were a judge now, but I didn't understand that you were. He struggled for words, apparently grappling with concepts he'd never bothered to understand before. That I was what? Important. Like, historically important. The article says you're the youngest person ever appointed to this position. It says, legal scholars are studying your decisions. It says you might influence American law for decades. These were facts that had been true since my appointment, information that had been available to anyone interested enough to research federal judicial positions. But it had taken a Washington Post article to make them real for my parents. The SIR position carries a lot of responsibility, I acknowledged. Tiff, why didn't you tell us it was such a big deal? Why didn't you explain what this all meant? The question was so breathtakingly obtuse that I was momentarily speechless. I'd spent 15 years trying to explain what my achievements meant. From law school honors through Supreme Court clerkship to federal prosecution to judicial nomination, every milestone had been met with polite disinterest or active concern about my impractical choices. I tried to, Dad. Many times. But you never said you were going to be famous. You never said newspapers would write about you. Fame and media. Coverage weren't the point, and they never had been. The Washington Post hadn't featured me because I sought attention, but because my judicial decisions were contributing to constitutional law in meaningful ways. The recognition was a byproduct of excellence, not its goal. But explaining this distinction would require Dad to understand the difference between seeking fame and earning respect through professional achievement, a nuance that seemed beyond his current comprehension. Over the following days, the calls multiplied. Distant relatives emerged from decades of minimal contact to express their newfound pride in having a famous judge in the family. High school classmates reached out through social media, sharing the Washington Post article with comments like, I went to school with her, and I always knew she'd be successful. The revisionist history was remarkable. People who'd barely acknowledged my existence during my academic and professional climb were now claiming association with my success. Family members who'd questioned my career choices were now boasting about their connection to a nationally recognized constitutional scholar. Mom called 3 more times that week, each conversation revealing new discoveries from her careful reading of legal coverage about my judicial decisions. She'd apparently been researching my career online, finding articles and interviews I'd given over the years that she'd never bothered to read when they were originally published. I found that speech you gave at Stanford last year, she said, during one call. The one about constitutional interpretation in the digital age. Did you know they posted it online? I'd sent her the link when the speech was originally published, suggesting she might find it interesting. She'd never responded to my email. I saw that, yes. It has over 50,000 views, and the comments are all saying how brilliant you are, how clearly you explain complicated legal concepts. The speech had been part of my ongoing scholarly work, contributing to academic discussions about how constitutional principles should evolve with technological advancement. I'd been proud of the positive reception from legal scholars and constitutional law experts. But having my mother discover my professional reputation through Google searches felt surreal, like watching her meet a stranger who happened to share my name and career history. "There are so many articles about you," she continued. "Law review pieces, conference presentations, interviews with legal publications. When did you do all this?" "Over the years, Mom. It's part of the job." "But why?" Didn't I know about any of it? The question contained its own answer. She hadn't known because she'd never been interested enough to pay attention, never curious enough to research my work, never engaged enough to understand what my career actually involved. Now, faced with external validation she couldn't ignore, she was scrambling to catch up on 15 years of achievements she'd dismissed or overlooked. The most painful call came from Dad the following weekend. "Tiff, I've been thinking about that ceremony, the one where you became a judge." "The swearing-in ceremony." "Yeah, that one. I think maybe we left too early. People have been asking me about it, and I realized I don't really remember what that Supreme Court Justice said about you." Justice Morrison's remarks had been recorded and were available online, part of the federal court's official documentation. But Dad had been so unengaged during the actual ceremony that he'd missed one of the most significant moments of my life. He spoke about judicial responsibility and constitutional interpretation. But what did he say about you specifically? "People keep telling me it must have been really special, having a Supreme Court justice there." It had been special, extraordinarily special. Justice Morrison had praised my legal scholarship, my commitment to equal justice, and my potential to contribute significantly to federal jurisprudence. His presence had been an honor that recognized both my qualifications and the historic nature of my appointment. But my parents had been checking their phones during his remarks, eager to leave. Before the reception even began, he was very complimentary about my qualifications and potential contributions to the federal bench. "I should have paid more attention," Dad said, his voice carrying what might have been regret. "I didn't realize how important it was." The admission was both validating and heartbreaking. Validating because it represented the first acknowledgement that he'd failed to recognize the significance of my achievements. Heartbreaking because it had taken external validation to prompt this belated recognition. By the end of that week, my voicemail was full of messages from family members and hometown acquaintances who'd discovered my professional prominence through media coverage. Each caller expressed variations on the same theme: surprise at my success, pride in their connection to me, and regret that they hadn't realized sooner how important I'd become. The irony was profound. The same achievements they were now celebrating had been minimized, questioned, or ignored when they were occurring. The federal judicial appointment they now recognized as historic had been treated as just another job change when it happened. My parents had spent years missing the story of my career as it unfolded, only to discover it through newspaper articles written for strangers. The consequences of their indifference were becoming clear, not just to them, but to their entire social circle. Friends and neighbors were asking questions they couldn't answer about their daughter's career, referencing achievements they'd never bothered to understand, expressing admiration for accomplishments they'd failed to recognize. For the first time, they were confronting the possibility that their daughter wasn't just different or overeducated, but genuinely exceptional in ways that commanded national respect, and they were realizing they'd been absent for all of it. The transformation in my parents' behavior reached its peak during Thanksgiving dinner, 8 months after my swearing-in ceremony. For the first time in my adult life, I had become the centerpiece of family conversation, but not in the way I'd once hoped for. Mom had spent the week before the holiday calling relatives to ensure they knew about Tiffany's success, as she'd begun referring to my judicial career. She'd printed copies of the Washington Post article to distribute like family photographs, highlighting quotes from Justice Rodriguez and constitutional law professors with a yellow marker. "Did you know that Harvard Law School is using one of Tiffany's decisions as a case study?" she announced to my assembled cousins, aunts, and uncles, her voice carrying a pride that felt both genuine and deeply strange. I sat at the dining room table watching this performance with a mixture of amusement and melancholy. The same woman who'd dismissed my law review editorship as extra work was now reciting my judicial accomplishments to anyone within earshot. The same relatives who'd barely acknowledged my law school graduation were hanging on every detail of my recent constitutional decisions. "Tell them about the Supreme Court thing," Dad prompted, carving the turkey with uncharacteristic enthusiasm. "Tell them about how you might get nominated someday." This had become his favorite conversation starter, the possibility that his daughter might eventually sit on the highest court in the land. Never mind that such appointments typically came after decades of federal judicial experience. Never mind that I was focused on excelling in my current position rather than plotting future advancement. "It's far too early to think about that," I said diplomatically. "I'm still learning how to be a district judge." "But the newspapers said you're being mentioned," Mom interjected. "They said legal experts think you have the right qualifications." Legal experts. She'd been reading judicial commentary and constitutional law analysis with the dedication she'd once reserved for coupon circulars, trying to understand retroactively the career she'd ignored as it developed. My cousin Rachel, whose announcement had once overshadowed my international moot court victory, leaned forward with newfound interest. "So, what's it like being a federal judge? Do you get to make laws?" The question revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that still pervaded my family's perception of judicial work, but I answered patiently, explaining the difference between interpreting existing law and creating new legislation. I described the careful analysis required for constitutional questions, the precedent research involved in complex cases, the balance between individual rights and governmental authority. As I spoke, I noticed something that would have thrilled me years earlier, but now left me feeling oddly detached. Everyone was listening. Really listening, with the kind of focused attention I'd craved throughout law school and my early career. But the attention felt hollow, because it was based on external validation rather than genuine understanding. They were interested now because newspapers and legal scholars had told them to be interested, not because they'd developed any real appreciation for constitutional law or federal judicial responsibility. Uncle Mike, who'd once suggested I should get a real job instead of pursuing my Supreme Court clerkship, raised his wineglass in a toast. "To our Judge Tiffany, who's making the whole family proud." The toast was echoed around the table, with smiles and applause that should have felt like vindication. Instead, it felt like a performance, a collective attempt to rewrite 15 years of indifference and dismissal. Later that evening, as I helped Mom clear the dinner dishes, she pulled me aside for what appeared to be a rehearsed conversation. "Tiffany, I want you to know how proud your father and I are of what you've accomplished." I set down the serving platter I'd been holding and turned to face her fully. "Are you, Mom?" "Of course we are. You're a federal judge. You're famous." "But were you proud when I graduated second in my class from Stanford Law? Were you proud when Justice Rodriguez selected me for a Supreme Court clerkship? Were you proud when I won that international moot court competition?" She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direct questions. "Well, yes. But we didn't understand then how important those things were." "They were always important, Mom. They were important because I worked hard for them, because they represented everything I was trying to achieve. The importance didn't suddenly appear when the Washington Post wrote about it. But we couldn't have known you'd become so successful. You couldn't have known because you never bothered to understand what I was working toward. The conversation grew awkward, with Mom defending their past indifference while simultaneously trying to claim credit for current pride. I realized that this discussion, which I'd imagined having countless times over the years, was ultimately pointless. They would never truly understand what their dismissal had cost me emotionally. They would never acknowledge that my achievements had been significant long before external validation made them impossible to ignore. They would never recognize that authentic parental support should have been based on effort and dedication, rather than public recognition. But more importantly, I no longer needed them to understand these things. The next morning, I made a decision that would define the rest of our relationship. Instead of continuing to seek acknowledgement for past wounds or validation for future achievements, I would establish new boundaries based on realistic expectations. I called Jennifer from my childhood bedroom, looking out at the same Youngstown neighborhood where my ambitions had once seemed impossibly grand. "How was Thanksgiving with the newly proud parents?" she asked, her tone carrying the gentle sarcasm of someone who'd watched this family dynamic for over a decade. "Educational," I said. "I think I finally understand that I can love them without needing their approval, and I can maintain a relationship without expecting them to truly comprehend my career. That sounds healthy, but also kind of sad. It's both. But it's also freeing. I don't have to keep hoping they'll suddenly develop the capacity to understand constitutional law or appreciate intellectual achievement. I can just accept them as they are and focus my emotional energy on relationships that can sustain me professionally and personally." That afternoon, I drove back to Cleveland with a clarity I'd never experienced before. My parents would always be my parents, but they would never be the source of professional validation I'd once desperately wanted them to be. Back in my chambers the following Monday, I found my desk covered with congratulatory notes from colleagues across the federal judiciary. Judge Patricia Hawkins had sent a handwritten card praising my recent opinion on artificial intelligence surveillance. Justice Rodriguez had forwarded a Harvard Law Review article that cited my digital privacy decision as groundbreaking constitutional analysis. These responses came from people who understood the legal reasoning behind my decisions, who could appreciate the careful balance of constitutional principles and practical application that federal judicial work required. Their recognition was based on professional merit rather than media coverage, on scholarly analysis rather than social status. That week, I received an invitation to speak at the American Constitutional Law Association's annual conference, where I would present my judicial philosophy to the nation's leading legal scholars. The invitation came with a note from the conference organizer. "Your work on technology and constitutional interpretation is reshaping how we think about Fourth Amendment applications in the digital age." I accepted the invitation without calling my parents to share the news, not out of spite, but because I no longer felt compelled to seek their validation for every professional milestone. The achievement was meaningful because of its contribution to constitutional scholarship, not because of how it might impress people who didn't understand constitutional law. Over the following months, I developed a new rhythm in my family relationships. I attended holiday gatherings and maintained regular contact, but I stopped trying to educate them about my judicial work or seeking their appreciation for my career developments. When Dad mentioned my fame to his bowling league friends, I smiled politely, but didn't correct his misunderstanding of what federal judicial service actually involved. When Mom asked whether I might someday run for president, because I was already a judge, I gently explained the difference between judicial and executive branches without expecting her to truly grasp the distinction. Meanwhile, my professional relationships deepened in ways that provided the intellectual stimulation and emotional support I'd once hoped to find at family gatherings. Justice Rodriguez invited me to participate in a symposium on emerging constitutional questions. Judge Hawkins asked me to co-author an article on federal judicial administration. Professor Stone recommended me for the American Law Institute, the most prestigious legal organization in the country. These invitations came from people who could engage with my work substantively, who understood the complex legal reasoning behind judicial decisions, who shared my commitment to constitutional principles and equal justice under law. 6 months later, I received news that would have once sent me racing to the phone to call my parents. The American Bar Association had selected me for their Outstanding Federal Judge Award, recognizing exceptional contributions to constitutional jurisprudence and judicial excellence in the digital age. Instead of calling home immediately, I walked to my chamber's window and looked out at the federal courthouse plaza where I'd taken my judicial oath 14 months earlier. The building represented everything I'd worked toward: intellectual rigor, constitutional authority, the power to shape American law through careful analysis and principled decision-making. My parents' belated pride, however genuine it might now be, could never equal the satisfaction of knowing that my judicial decisions were contributing meaningfully to constitutional interpretation, that young attorneys were studying my opinions in law school, that fellow judges were seeking my perspective on emerging legal questions. When I finally called to share the ABA news, Mom's response was predictably enthusiastic. "Another award! You're getting so many honors now." But her excitement, while nice to hear, felt secondary to the message I'd received from Justice Rodriguez. "This recognition is well-deserved. Your thoughtful approach to constitutional questions and your clear writing style are setting new standards for federal judicial opinions." That evening, I had dinner with Jennifer and Marcus, who'd driven up from Cincinnati to celebrate the award. Our conversation ranged from judicial philosophy to constitutional interpretation to the practical challenges of federal case management. These were people who could appreciate not just the honor of receiving recognition, but the scholarly work that had earned it. They understood that federal judicial awards weren't popularity contests, but acknowledgments of legal excellence and constitutional scholarship. "You know what's remarkable about your career trajectory?" Jennifer said over dessert. "You've managed to contribute significantly to constitutional law while maintaining your integrity and staying true to your principles. That's exactly what you said you wanted to do back in law school." She was right. The goals I'd articulated 15 years earlier, to use legal education in service of constitutional principles, to contribute meaningfully to American jurisprudence, to earn respect through excellence rather than connections, had been achieved, despite rather than because of family support. My parents' newfound pride was a pleasant byproduct of success, but it wasn't the validation that sustained me through complex cases or difficult decisions. That validation came from knowing that my judicial opinions were contributing to the ongoing conversation about constitutional rights in a changing society. As I walked back to my chambers that evening, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not because my parents had finally recognized my achievements, but because I'd finally stopped needing them to. The federal courthouse stood illuminated against the Cleveland skyline, its classical architecture symbolizing the enduring principles of American justice that I'd sworn to uphold and interpret. Inside those walls, I was Judge Tiffany Richardson, lifetime appointee to the federal bench, constitutional scholar, and guardian of the legal principles that protected every American citizen's rights. Outside those walls, I was someone whose family had finally learned to be proud of her, but who no longer needed their pride to define her worth. The difference was everything. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.